To co-create is to really foster an understanding of the necessity to open up processes to those most affected by an intervention or initiative and make them the subjects rather than the objects of that creativity. I think the term creation directs us to the notion of something being created, right? The outcome. When I think of co-creation, I dwell on the process. To co-create something entails a process of engagement, sense making, problem solving, or even making mistakes together. That's part of co-creation towards the achievement of a possibility, because to co-create something, there's no fixed outcome that you can foresee. In my own research, I coined this term viewing disasters, disaster reconstruction, or even development through epistemologies of the vulnerable. The vulnerable are often those who are targeted and intervened upon, but aren't really given that space to actually influence decisions that affect their lives.
Hello and welcome to Collaboratory. My name is Nicole Dean, and you have just heard the voice of Kaira Zoe Cañete, our guest for this episode of the Collaboratory Conversation Series, where we talk to co-creative practitioners about their learning journeys, histories and experiences of co-creativity in action. Kaira is a researcher and development practitioner with a deep commitment to finding ways to support those who typically have less voice and power in society, but who are often most affected by the processes and outcomes of research. Her work focuses on the intersections of gender, development and disasters. She's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the International Institute of Social Studies at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and previously co-founded an NGO called A2D Research Group for Alternatives to Development in the Philippines. When we take on the position of researcher, whether this is through conducting consultations for a specific project, running participatory sessions in a co-design process, or doing academic research, we take on significant power to shape the experiences of those with whom we work and the knowledge that is generated about them. This power is seen through the questions we ask, who we choose to interview, what is done with the information we gather, and how we make and present meaning about it. In our conversation, Kaira shares reflections from her recent PhD work in the Philippines, and we explore what research processes can look like when they are co-created with participants. She offers some personal and practical approaches to sharing power and to designing and implementing research that gives back to participants rather than just extracting knowledge from them. I met Kaira in a playground where we connected over ideas of co-creation, the role of gender in development, and our mutual love of the Philippines.
I often like to introduce myself in terms of what I do for work and what I do for what I call my soul work. So for me, work is about my career in a specific field, owning whatever skills I have and transmitting knowledge. But on the other hand, what I call my soul work is what I find meaningful, something that allows me to enact my own political and ethical standpoint as a global South feminist scholar and practitioner. But of course, as a Filipino feminist scholar, my soul work really entails using my skills and channeling my passions to contribute towards building solidarities with grassroots communities, especially women, and finding ways to develop spaces where we can engage with each other and map out possibilities for creating better, more caring and just futures. I was born and raised in the Philippines, so it's considered one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. And I've lived for many years in less affluent neighborhoods in my home city of Cebu. Now, although calamities such as those brought about by typhoons, floods, earthquakes, and so on form a part of the backdrop of life in the Philippines, it was actually not initially central to my own work. So I was for a good number of years a community organizer in urban poor communities in Cebu, fresh out of university, so quite young, in my early 20s. And I was heavily involved in local women's movements for gender rights and social justice.
These lived experiences of disaster, women's rights and community activism combined to influence Kaira's PhD research, which aimed to examine disaster reconstruction processes from the perspectives of women in Tacloban City in the Philippines.
I was asking myself, what are the possibilities for reimagining resilient recovery drawn from women's experiences? So, what can women's experiences reveal? So, I investigated competing views of resilience and disaster recovery and highlighted the political as well as the ethical dimensions of housing reconstruction and relocation of disaster affected urban poor communities.
The disaster recovery process that Kaira's research focused on was caused by Typhoon Haiyan, locally known as Yolanda, which struck the Philippines in November 2013. It was considered the most powerful storm that ever made landfall in human history.
So at that moment, I was in Cebu when the typhoon struck and was very much involved in disaster response as well as conducting studies and evaluations for different organizations in the post-disaster context. So Tacloban, which is a highly urbanized city in the eastern region of the country, really bore the brunt of the typhoon and suffered immense losses and damage. So I found it to be an interesting place to study, given that urban disasters have only relatively recently figured as one of the pressing issues of our times. So the fact that the city had undertaken an ambitious relocation program that is resettling about 90,000 people from coastal danger zones to the northern peripheries of the city, it really intrigued me, and I wanted to understand the gender dimensions of this particular initiative. So with my background in feminist advocacy, I became interested in how women experienced and practiced disaster recovery. And I ask, from these experiences, what can we learn or need to unlearn about the ways communities are being built? And I guess the best way to do that would be actually to approach the matter from the perspective of those who are most affected.
These questions led Kaira to investigate different approaches to conducting research that aligned with her values and made sense for her PhD.
At first, I started to think about the conventional techniques in doing research, primarily because it was comfortable. You didn't really have to think about like how you're going to design. So you're just going to include them in your methodology. And then there's not a lot of question as to how you're going to do it because it has been proven to be used in a wide range of research studies. But for me, I've always been interested in how to make research more participatory. And beyond this PhD project, for example, in how I've always done my consultancy work, consultancy research, as well as some of the research grants I've had in the past, I was really interested in finding ways to make research less extractive and to have more of the voice of study participants come out in that research process. So one of the things that I wanted to address with the method were two main points. First is that, especially in disaster settings, power imbalances between the researcher and the research is really very stark, very pronounced, and these relationships are really prone to abuse. And I wanted to decenter myself as a researcher because the moment that you do research, your voice as an author already dominates, right? From developing your questions, your instruments, interpreting your data. So your voice as an author already dominates. So I wanted to, not completely, I don't think it can be completely decentered. There is still that power dynamics, but as much as possible to be able to share that kind of space with your study participants and to address these power imbalances. Second, I problematized the kind of instruments that are mediums of inquiry that are often applied in these contexts. Interviews, questionnaires, and most of these are actually very much focused on word-based and highly technical instruments. And I was trying to explore what tools might be able to capture the complexity of disaster experiences, the techniques that can effectively draw out and generate narratives and stories, as well as the embodied experiences and emotions that are often taken for granted in many disaster research. I opted for using a photo-based method, which I eventually called photo cuento. I characterize photo cuento as a feminist photo-based research method, and it utilizes techniques of photo elicitation, which basically just means using photographs in an interview setting. And the term cuento is a Filipino, which means story. So in a literal sense, photo cuento is a method that allows study participants to tell their stories with photographs, and therefore, in the context of research, help co-construct their narratives of disaster recovery.
Photocuento was inspired by other photo-based methods, including the work of Jimena Bunster and Elsa Cheney in the 1980s, who used a similar method called talking pictures interviews in a study of everyday experiences of working women in Lima, Peru. You can find links to articles about these and other photo elicitation methods in the show notes for this episode.
Photocuento comprises three main stages. It's image generation, so the process of producing photographs, the interview tool development, which is the creation of a photo album, which would serve as the interview tool, and administering interviews using photographs. So throughout this process, women participants were actually placed at the center. Unlike Bunster and Cheney's work, however, or their method, the images were participant generated rather than researcher generated. So meaning the women who participated in my study decided what images to take, how to take them, and when. So women deliberated and decided on which photos to use for the photo album and identified the thematic areas upon which the interviews would be structured. So I may have described it in a very linear manner, but this was really far from being linear. There were many times that I've had to reflect and rethink the appropriateness of the approach and strategies. And at one point, even the women were criticizing the kind of questions that I had initially posed. And they eventually suggested a better way of approaching the study, which actually really helped enrich it overall.
This method of creative iteration enabled research participants to actively co-create the research with her. But how did Kaira set up her research to build the trust and relationships necessary for a process like Photocuento to work?
In terms of the process of entering the communities and starting these engagements, I was really very conscious of my approach to entering the communities for the first time. I knew that there were so many studies actually being conducted after Yolanda. People in the communities were already starting to feel weary and wary of researchers swooping in and extracting data and then leaving and then months later become experts in their field. And there's actually a common saying there that Typhoon Yolanda was a disaster that launched 1,000 PhDs. So I was like, oh my goodness, was I going to be part of those who would like claim expert knowledge after I've done my PhD? And I really felt a great discomfort in that thought, as in many ways, the limitations of time and resources to do a PhD don't leave you much choice either. So I'm not judging other researchers who are also doing their own thing in these communities. But for me, I needed to make sure that my intentions were clearly communicated and that I could facilitate that room for engaged relationships, as I said previously, as best as I can, given the limitations. And so my research was actually divided into different stages. The first stage involved getting to know the context. I just didn't want to swoop in and say, hey, I know everything about this. So even if I am Filipino, I am not from Tacloban. I speak a different language. I needed to acquaint myself with the different political and social dynamics. So I started talking to frontline workers, government officials, community organizers, and so on. And when I first went to the communities, I did not immediately dive into my interviews. First, I just attended and observed activities, gatherings, and not even formal activities, fiestas, or how do we call that in English? Feast of Patron Saints. That's a very big thing in the Philippines. And so just attending these informal activities and gatherings and then have them get used to my presence. And I also allowed them to ask me questions about why I was there. It was like suddenly popping up into their like karaoke sessions or whatever. And then, in fact, I did not start recruiting participants until I returned for my second field research months after. By then, some of them had already interacted with me and were in fact very helpful in seeking out other participants. So that initial engagement I had with them was really valuable. I also need to acknowledge that I got through that process through the help of individuals I met there who facilitated my entry into communities. So for those who journeyed with me in the process, my research assistant, Janela Balboa, and Pearl Madeloso, who are fresh graduates from the University of the Philippines in Tacloban, were really very helpful in that regard. And so it wasn't like you just swoop in and I'd like to interview you. So I was quite conscious of slowly easing myself in, getting them used to me and building that trust as well, which I think is really very important in developing these relationships. When I was ready to start with the actual data collection or data construction process, I went back to the communities and had a discussion with the women I had already interacted with, and also friends like community organizers also helped to invite others to come together. And then I discussed what my research was about, what I planned to do, and whether or not they would be interested in taking part of the research. And it was very crucial to state there was no obligation on their part to actually participate. So it was purely voluntary. And I think that's an important thing to stress, because especially in the Filipino culture that I grew up in, we are expected to always be accommodating and hospitable. So there's that cultural expectation. So I wanted to make sure that there was no such expectation on my part, and that they were very much free to say no to take part in the activities. And after that, when I was able to have enough volunteers to participate in the first stage of the research, which was image generation. And so that's when I started to hold a workshop on what we were actually going to do, setting up what the expectations were, and so on.
Kaira's description of building relationships and taking a slow approach to entering communities provides a clear example of a co-creative mindset of moving at the speed of trust. That's something that I often need to remind myself of when faced with time constraints in a co-creative process. So, how did she practically co-create her research with the women who participated in the project? And in particular, how did she manage the tensions of maintaining a level of control over the process whilst also allowing it to be shaped by others?
I began that research with the knowledge that the questions I initially set out were always going to be arbitrary. So I wasn't fixed on that these should be the questions that we should be asking. So it's basically just to jumpstart or to guide that process of inquiry. And so because I did a participant briefing before the actual image generation or taking of photographs, and there I talked about, again, the purpose of the research and what are the ethical considerations that we must take account of when we are taking photographs, as well as techniques in taking photographs. And there was an initial set of questions that I provided to them just to help them think about what kind of photographs that they will be taking. But I told them, you don't have to be limited or constrained by these questions. If you feel that there are images that you want to take, but don't really resonate with any of the questions, that is absolutely fine, because that's also part of the process of them being able to feed into that overall design. And that was actually why, as the process was rolling out, women were saying, like, we feel that these questions don't really capture our experiences, and we felt that you needed to ask this question first, because I was so focused on recovery and practices and what was helping the recovery. And they said, we cannot talk about recovery if we don't talk about our experience of the disaster. So we want to capture these places that reminded them of their experience as disaster survivors, and then talk about recovery, because they said their story won't be complete. And for me, that was such a very rich feedback that I got from them, to actually tell me that I was limited in my imagination in determining these questions. And I think among the biggest contributions that they had in that research was really to develop the research tool, because after they took the photographs, we had another workshop wherein they would present the photographs which they felt really represented their experiences. And then they had an exhibit, and then as they were viewing everyone else's work, they were interacting with each other and seeing the differences and similarities in their stories. And then they were the ones who came up with the themes for the research tool. And the research tool was not a word-based instrument. It was just mainly photographs, which we collated into a photo album. And at first I was really quite wary, or let's say anxious, because I wasn't really sure if it was going to work. And there's this funny thing that I did, since there were some missing pieces in the photo album, so that to make them more symmetrical, I inserted some photographs that I took myself. And so here I am again trying to control that process, and it's really a continuous struggle. So I inserted some photographs which I took, and I think people respond to this quite well. And it was so interesting when I was doing the actual interviews. I just gave them the photo album, and then they would discuss what these photographs meant to them. The photographs that I took were largely ignored. which is really contrary to my expectations because I think a lot of people will really like want to talk about this particular photo because I felt that was relevant. But no, the women who I interviewed were actually more engaged with the photographs that the other women had taken compared to the photographs that I had inserted in that photo album. So that was also a side of critical reflection as well. And that was one of my main realizations after data collection activity was that, I don't have to control everything. And then if you just trust in the process, because the process really helps, shape and influence how that research is going to turn out. And it actually produced something more than I expected.
Kaira's candid reflections on this process of sharing power show that it doesn't always come easily, and that the benefits of doing so can be profound. It also reminded me that it can feel quite uncomfortable to give up some of our control and be in a space of uncertainty, ready to let things emerge.
I had mixed feelings about it. First, of course, I was excited because I wanted to see what it will eventually produce. But most of it, as I was in the thick of things, I was so anxious that it translated to physical pain, you know, especially during that period, when I just left them alone to take the photographs and I don't know what was happening. And I couldn't like ask them like, okay, what photos are you taking now? And all these things, you can't control it. So there was really a point when, I was vomiting through the night because just I couldn't sleep. And it occurred to me that letting go of power is painful. And I can understand why many practitioners or researchers don't really want to let go of that power because there's always this tendency to want to control things. But I think eventually it really paid off. I just sat there with my anxiety and I was just telling myself just to trust that process and to, always practice reflexivity all throughout.
Reflexivity. It's a word that Kaira uses a lot when she's talking about the process of reflecting on her practice, including what she was thinking and feeling at the time and how it influenced what happened in the research. Kaira has some useful insights about how she integrated and applied her learnings in the research process so that her participants ultimately had a positive experience.
It was also a trial and error on my part. I found that the first few interviews that I had were a bit distant, and I was concerned, like, okay, maybe I'm doing something wrong. And what I realized was that when I was doing the interviews, I was holding the photo album and I was the one flipping through them and asking them, okay, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And that created a barrier because I was still the one who was in control of the conversation. And so after the first few interviews, I realized maybe I should just give them the album and let them talk about it and what they felt about it. And so when I started to do that, and I think it was also symbolic in a way that you're actually handing over the power to direct the conversation however they wanted to direct the conversation. And true enough, the stories that we're telling were actually much richer and more open. They were the ones who were flipping through the pages and then they could skip, oh, can I look at all the other photos here? And so that was quite open. Yeah, so taking away the need again to be in control and to just let them freely choose what they want to talk about as prompted by the photographs. And I think that really helped. And of course, to be genuinely interested in what they're saying, to have that focus and to look at them as they are talking, acknowledging their emotions and their experiences are actually also very important. And I think one of the things that was also important was that at the end of the interview, I really asked for their feedback about what is it that you particularly liked or didn't like, and was there a question that I wasn't able to ask. So still keeping it open-ended and to allow that space for them to contribute to all that.
While it's critical for the success of any co-creative process, sharing power and control is often easier said than done in my experience. So what advice does Kaira have for those of us who are likely to encounter these uncomfortable moments in our work?
You just need a lot of self-awareness as well. And it's something that I had to develop as I was going through it. But I think being able to share that power with your research participants is in itself an objective or an aim of the research, a goal. It's not just what you want to produce out of the research, but it should in itself also be a goal of the research if you adhere to this ethical point of view about how research should be conducted. And I think in a more practical sense, because I often hear a lot of talk about we need to be reflexive when we're doing research, and I fully support that notion of reflexivity. But I think we also need to be able to operationalize that reflexivity. So how do we operationalize that reflexivity so that it also facilitates a critical self-examination of how the research is turning out and what your role is in influencing that whole process. And for me, and of course, I don't prescribe any particular method, but in my own practice, how I operationalized reflexivity was that I kept a separate reflexivity diary from which was separate from my field notes. So the field notes were there for observations and observations for analysis, but my reflexivity note was basically more on methodological issues that I encountered in the field. And these were actually very helpful, for example, in prompting me to reflect, okay, why was I feeling this way? Why was I feeling uncomfortable? Why was I vomiting through the night? Why wasn't I able to sleep? And that was really helpful in engaging with the data as well and my role in that. So I would really encourage researchers and practitioners to find ways in which you could put into practice these methods of enabling you to do critical self-examination as you are going through the research process.
Despite the benefits, conducting research in this way can be challenging. What enabled her to pursue this co-creative approach?
I think first is as a researcher or practitioner is to be committed to that kind of ethical standpoint, like what your general approach is to the research. Because if that is not clear to me, I wouldn't have taken the time to really think through what I was doing and sorting out the bad practices that I was doing as well. So it's important not just to highlight the good things, but also the bad practices that I was doing and to be able to address these issues that were apparently affecting the research process in a negative way. So for example, I'm always trying to maintain that control and trying to direct the conversation. And I think that was one of the things that I struggled with throughout, but it was because I was committed to that process. So I think that's one important point that is an enabler. Being trustworthy as a researcher is of primary importance to be able to demonstrate that you are worthy of the trust of your study participants. And I did this as well by opening up myself to questions. It's just not me asking questions about their lives. I also asked them to ask me questions. What did they want to know about me? And so I also talked about my children. I also talked about my experiences. And I even talked about other issues that a lot of women were interested in, such as contraception and all these things, to connect with them in that manner and not just simply keep it very distant. Okay, so you open up yourself to be questioned as well and to be critiqued and to consider also the circumstances of participants in a more practical manner. For example, when I'm planning workshops, what time of the day should I do it? Because most of these are mothers or have care responsibilities and care work. And these are things that you really need to consider when you're planning your research activities. Would this time or this place be conducive for them? What are their constraints? So, for example, a lot of them usually had to bring in children because in the Philippines, women are primarily assigned the work of care. And so for every activity, they always bring their children with them. And how do I accommodate these? So I also made sure that there was a safe space for children and with lots of activities for them to do while I was doing the workshop with the women or their mothers. So that was actually to be attuned to the needs of your participants and not just what you need to accomplish with that activity.
Another question that comes up when I think about co-creation of research is that of ownership. In a typical PhD, the scholar relies on owning their thesis to graduate. So how did Kaira navigate the idea of ownership in this co-created research process?
That's also a side of discomfort for me, actually, because that's why I'm always saying, like, please don't call this research as like the ideal or something like that, because I'm still uncomfortable with the fact that at the end of the day, I get the credit because it's my thesis. You know, I cannot say that there is someone else who's authoring this thesis with me because a thesis is supposed to be an individual achievement, right? And so how do I sort of reconcile that? If the research is co-created, if these narratives are co-constructed, but then who gets the credit? And that's still something that I'm really struggling with at the moment. And that's what also sparked me to think about, like, there must be something else that must be done after the formal research is completed. right? In terms of like, okay, I've written this up and it's done and all the objectives are met. But in terms of how do this go back to the communities and then they also take ownership of what is done with that research is for me the more important goal. And unfortunately, we had some plans with the communities there. Some women were saying that they wanted to hold the exhibit outside of the community because they felt that it would be able to amplify the issues that they were facing and actually have those in power pay attention to their difficulties and challenges. And we had something planned, but then COVID happened and I wasn't able to return. I haven't been able to go back to the Philippines in like 2 years now. I think that's one of the regrets that I have. So maybe in the future, doing this kind of methodology is to also think about what comes after that research. After you produce your publication or after whatever output that is generated, how do you take it back to the community so that they can actually make more use of what you've done?
Relational, time-intensive, unpredictable, and requiring that we give up some of our power and control. For me, Kaira's story highlights that co-creating research is not necessarily the easiest path we could choose. So why then might we go to this extra effort and engage wholeheartedly with community members to shape the research process?
Of course, I couldn't claim to be able to like have improved their lives or gave them some material assistance in any way. However, just from my engagement with women as I was going through the data collection process, they actually appreciated being able to participate in that research. First, because they saw themselves not as sources of information, again, but as actual researchers who are also trying to rediscover facets of their life after disaster. There was this one woman during the workshops who said, okay, because we are researchers now, and these are the things that we also learned from our participation. And I think that's one benefit that they also saw, that they were also learning new things about their situation. Second, for those who participated in the interviews, the third stage, the Photo Cuento interviews themselves, I always ask towards the end, what did you think about the interview and how I interviewed you? And was there anything that you liked or disliked and so on? And many of the participants actually said that they appreciated being interviewed because it allowed them to release a lot of their emotions and their views, which they felt like 4 or 5 years after the disaster, they already felt that they were being forgotten. And so they felt that it was a way for them to air out their opinions and their views about their current situation, as well as to release still a lot of pent-up emotions that they weren't able to really share with others. And I was actually quite concerned about the issue of re-traumatizing them. And of course, I had to make sure that processes were in place in case something adverse would crop up, like re-traumatizing participants. So making sure that process is in place. But as I said, a lot of them actually said that they appreciated it because how the women had structured the photo album. So of course, it started with disaster and the experience of disaster, but it always ended up with hope for recovery and what is it that is helping them to recover. So it also helped them think about maybe things that are often taken for granted. What is helping me right now? And what are the possibilities? And what are my aspirations that I want to reach? And that was how the interviews usually ended on a positive and hopeful note. And thirdly, in a more practical sense, one of my participants also said that she learned from the Photo Cuento process. And because she was active in their community organization in their resettlement village, and there was basically an issue there with their resettlement community being placed next to a dump site. Garbage was always like part of their everyday life. And so what she did was she took photographs of that particular issue and helped craft a petition and attach those photographs. And I think it was inspired by the Photo Cuento process to inspire these forms of agency for them to advocate for their particular issues. And I think that was one of the benefits as well of participating in the research.
And with that, we bring this conversation to a close. We hope you've enjoyed hearing Kaira's story of co-creative research in action, and would love to hear your thoughts and reflections on the episode or on your own related practice. Drop us a line at collaboratorypodcast@gmail.com.
This episode of Collaboratory was written and edited by Maya Haviland and Nicole Dean. Series producer Maya Haviland. Audio engineering by Nick McCorriston and music made especially for us by Seprock. Additional research and production support by Nicole O'Dowd. Collaboratory is produced on the lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Ngunnawal people. We pay our respects and ongoing gratitude to the custodians, past, present and future, of the lands on which we work and of the knowledges from which we learn. Collaboratory is a production of the Scaffolding Cultural Co-Creativity Project, hosted by the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies in the College of Arts and Social Sciences at the Australian National University. Funding is generously provided by the Australian National University Translational Fellowship Scheme.